Good evening, and thank you for joining us for our program today. My name is Gavin Cleespies, and I'm the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. Today, we have a program introducing our new podcast, The Object of History. The podcast is hosted by two staff members from our research department, Katy Morris and Kanisorn Wongsrichanalai. They highlight items from our collection and speak with other staff members who can shed light on the stories behind some of the most amazing pieces to be found at MHS. The format of today's program is that we will be joined by Dr. Wongsrichanalai and Ms. Morris, as well as two of our most knowledgeable staff members, Ann Bentley and Peter Drummey. We will play some short clips from the podcast, and then our staff will speak about the objects and some of the stories that had to be left on the cutting room floor when making the podcast. I'd like to extend a special welcome to anyone who might be joining us for the first time. If you're not familiar with MHS, we are the oldest historical society in America and have been collecting, preserving, publishing, and sharing our history since 1791. We hold an amazing collection of close to 14 million manuscript pages, including the papers of 3 of the first 6 US presidents. We hold collections from mothers, millers, protesters, and poets. We make all this material available to researchers for free. We also host over 100 events a year, including programs like tonight's, academic seminars, workshops for educators, and special tours. We're able to do this thanks to the support of our donors. So if you are not yet a contributor to MHS, I hope you'll consider supporting our work. All of our speakers today are quite accomplished people, but to give a very brief introduction to each of them, Dr. Wongsrichanalai is the Director of Research at the Massachusetts Historical Society. He received his PhD from the University of Virginia, and prior to coming to MHS, was an associate professor in the Department of History at the Anglo State University in Texas. Katy Morris is the Assistant Director of Research and the Executive Producer of our podcast. She holds a BA from Smith College and an MA in Oral History from Columbia University. Ann Bentley has been with the Massachusetts Historical Society since 1973, first as a conservator of manuscripts and then as a curator of the art collection. Since 1984, she has been responsible for the Society's numismatic collection, consisting of coins, tokens, medals, badges, and paper currency. Finally, Peter Drummey is the Stephen T. Riley librarian for the Massachusetts Historical Society. He has worked at MHS since the late 1970s and has a deep knowledge of Boston and New England history. He is a frequent guest on local media outlets and has helped tens of thousands of researchers. He's probably been thanked in the acknowledgements of more books than most people will read in their lifetime. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to my colleagues, Dr. Wongsrichanalai and Katy Morris.
Thank you very much, Gavin, and thank you all of you for joining us today. We hope that you'll enjoy the conversation, and of course, we encourage you to listen to the podcast, The Object of History, as well. I'm just going to make some brief remarks about the start of this process. It's been a 2-year-long process to get this out and develop it. Credit where credit is due. The idea for the podcast came from the MHS president, Catherine Allgore. This is very much her vision, and she wanted it to help highlight some of the collections that we have here at the MHS. She turned it over to the research department, where she knew that she had 2 staff members who have oral history backgrounds. And so we were able to turn that to our advantage in interviewing both Peter and Ann, as well as other scholars as well. If you're unfamiliar with a podcast, it's basically a radio show that you can listen to anytime and download and take with you. And we certainly hope that this is useful. We've heard from people that have listened to this while jogging or while or lounging around. So it's good for all climates, shall we say. As I mentioned, it is a collections-based program and podcast. I first came to the Historical Society as a graduate student looking at manuscripts, and Peter was one of the librarians who helped me when I was here. And so many academics know the MHS as a place for collections, for manuscripts, and we are primarily a research library. We have about 14 million manuscript pieces and counting, but we also have thousands of objects and artifacts and prints and numismatic pieces. And so a lot of this does not get to see the light of day. And our goal here is to highlight the manuscripts as well as all of these other objects so people will learn about them and want to learn more about them and perhaps visit us here at the MHS. So each episode, and we've released 5 so far for season 1, each episode highlights a document or an object or a set of them. We try to vary them up to, again, show the variety of objects and items that we have here at the MHS. We also space them out by century. So if you look at season 1, 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, and later on, when we talk about season 2, we'll go farther back in time. But the MHS certainly has objects and artifacts, well, actually going back quite a long way to, I think, is it the 13th century that we have?
Something medieval, I think.
Yeah, I think we have some of those too. So a lot to look forward to, but that's how we have arranged all of this, just to sample this, to highlight this for our listeners, and to encourage them. This is just a hook. This is just the beginning. We want people to come to the website to take a look at the objects. There are pictures of them. Zoom in, take a look at them closely, and then visit us at 1154 Boylston Street to learn more about them, or to see them in person and perhaps hold them. So in this hour, we are going to highlight 3 clips from the 5 episodes that we have released. We're going to ask some live questions of Peter and Anne. They're going to show some of those objects in the flesh. And then there should be plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. Did I miss anything?
I don't think so. I think you've covered it.
Okay.
So let's go to our first clip. I'll just go ahead and set that up and then we'll play it for you. This first clip is from our 4th episode on Elizabeth Freeman, a woman born into slavery in the 18th century who successfully sued for her freedom and helped bring about the end of slavery in Massachusetts. In this clip, you will hear myself and Anne, our curator of art and artifacts, looking closely at a miniature portrait of Elizabeth Freeman.
I think we need to turn the sound up a little, Olivia. Ironic that this is a podcast we're talking about and we're having audio problems.
We can't hear anything, so stop sharing.
Bear with us just a minute, folks. We will play it for you.
Okay, now go to share again and say, yeah. Did you do that before?
So try one more time.
Should we turn to the paint?
To the portrait, yes. This is a miniature, which is watercolor on ivory, and her hair is white. You've got these lovely little tiny white curls under a white mob cap that ties under her chin. You can just see the gold beads around her neck. And then she's wearing a plain dress of the period, which is blue. And she is seated facing the sitter's left, but her eyes are skewed over looking at the viewer.
Yeah, she's looking right at you.
Yes. I've often wondered if she actually sat for that. I think she may have, because by that point, she's a woman of leisure at that point after working her whole life. Only people of means and leisure could afford to sit still and pay for a portrait. And it's a very small thing. In its frame, it's, maybe 3.5 by 6 inches, if that.
When you look at this portrait, what does it tell you about Elizabeth?
It tells me that she was very fashionable. But you look at that lovely little ruffle around her face with her bonnet. That's not a utilitarian bonnet. That's her best bonnet. And I see here an older woman who's earned her rest. By golly, she's earned her rest to sit for a portrait.
Yes, I like that. And she's earned her fancy dress.
Nobody's hands but hers provided her livelihood.
Wonderful. So it's so fun to revisit that clip. And my first question is for you, Anne. I had so much fun looking at this portrait with you. Actually, I love looking at any of our pieces with you, but I would love if you could share with the audience a little bit about the reactions people have when they come and see this teeny tiny portrait.
Well, that's exactly the reaction that we get in the reading room when we bring it down, because she's very, very small. People are used to seeing enlargements of her because we very rarely lend her out. As a miniature, she's very, very light sensitive. So most museums who want to borrow her for a year or so. And we only allow her on display for 3 months to limit the light exposure so that we preserve the image. So most museums use reproductions of Mum Bet, of Elizabeth Freeman, in their exhibits. So people are used to these very large examples of her, and they're taken aback when they come across the original. She's so small, is what they all say. I had no idea. So.
Yes, even just today, when you had pulled it out, I gasped all over again because it's just so small. You mentioned that it goes on loan. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the places she's traveled to?
Not very many. Let's see, in 1995, she went to the DAR Museum in Washington, D.C. And in 2014, she went to the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston when they did the Magna Carta exhibit. The theme was freedom, obviously. So she was one of the loans to that exhibit. And we also I brought out her bracelet because it also is extremely small because beads were lost. So this is all that there is. And online you can see the close-ups with the engraving and her name engraved on the back. And this is going to be in one of our favorite things exhibits in the spring, so people can come see it in person then.
Wonderful. That will be, it's such a treat to see it in person. So I hope everyone can come and do that. Peter, for those who haven't had a chance to listen to this episode yet, can you tell us a little bit about how Elizabeth's story has come down to us, not so much through her, but through the Sedgwick family? How does that shape the story we tell?
Yes, the story is primarily known through the writing in the middle of the 19th century of a novelist, Catherine Maria Sedgwick, who grew up after she won her freedom, Elizabeth Freeman, known to the Sedgwick family as Mum Bet. She took the name Elizabeth Freeman when she won her freedom. Catherine Maria Sedgwick's father, Theodore Sedgwick, as a young lawyer in the Berkshires during the Revolution, had represented Freeman in this suit for her own freedom. And so this was a story of this remarkable woman who sued to be free, and her suit and other freedom suits ended slavery in Massachusetts by a series of legal cases at the end of the American Revolution. But it's also a story where Theodore Sedgwick plays, in Catherine Maria's eyes, a heroic part as being the person who steps forward to take her case. What we have to remember is this is mostly recollection. That is, Catherine Maria Sedgwick is remembering Elizabeth Freeman as a mature lady, but also is telling stories that she heard about Freeman's early life. So this is a as told to story in the Sedgwick papers. And most of what we know about Freeman is seen through the lens of the Sedgwick family. And that's, of course, extraordinarily important, but it's not the story necessarily that Freeman would have told herself.
It's so important to remember. And you just mentioned, her role in history. It's so important, and yet I think Elizabeth Freeman's story isn't very well known. Do you have any thoughts on, and Anne, if you have any either, on why that is? Why don't we know her story better?
Well, if you live in the Berkshires, the westernmost county of Massachusetts, this is a very important figure. And so she was somebody who is locally celebrated, and in the legal and constitutional history of Massachusetts important because of these as a key figure in the suits that ended slavery here. But I think one of the things about this is perhaps through the 19th century is a kind of local hero. And I have to think that probably as a woman, given less regard than perhaps she deserved for her own role.
Yeah, there's a move afoot to create a statue of her in Stockbridge. And I believe that miniature was instrumental in helping the artist put a face on her. So I'm looking forward to seeing that when it happens. Special
Yes.
That's right. MHS field trip.
Yeah, we'll have to take the recorder and get
Remote
out there.
podcast.
Yes. Well, wonderful. Should we move on to the next clip? Kid, would you like to set that up?
Certainly. So this next clip is from our second episode, and it highlights the contributions of the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers. This is the first African-American regiment raised in the North during the American Civil War. If you've seen the film Glory, the 1989 film by Edward Swick, starring Matthew Broderick as Colonel Shaw, you will see the depiction of what this unit did, and the sword that Robert Gould Shaw wields as he charges Fort Wagner is displayed there. If you visited Boston Common and you've seen the statue of the 54th Massachusetts by Augustus St. Gaudens, you will notice that it is in Shaw's hand as well. Of course, the one that he's holding in that statue is not the actual one, as we know, because that sword was lost for a very long time until it came to the MHS. So here's a clip I think Anne and Peter are talking about the sword, and Olivia, we're ready for clip 2.
Picture this brand new sword when it was stolen, only been used twice. Gleaming steel with etched design in it, gilded grip, bright gold, and there is on one side the American flag, on the other side there is the Federal Eagle, and below that are the initials, RGS.
How does it feel when you hold it?
It feels heavy and it feels sad, because I think of the promise, and I think of the sacrifice of these beautiful souls that fought so hard, the bravery and the commitment and the pride and the conviction. And then I think of Reconstruction, so it's heavy and it's sad. Its promises unkept.
Robert Gould Shaw's life, his heroic death, he's come to symbolize something that it's greater than any single person can carry. The extraordinary part of this story, not a gallant young infantry officer, but the raising of an African-American regiment and all the people who make it up, that sort of hasn't perhaps got the attention it deserves. The other thing about it is it tends to freeze in time the story of the regiment in 1863, which was just at the start of their military experience.
Thank you very much. And there's Peter holding the sword.
Yeah, this is a magical moment. Mm-hmm. And if I just want to avoid stabbing Anne here, but I wanted to, they're very good pictures, but this is really remarkable to have this in your hands.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to be careful because it's
heavy and it is sharp. But the amazing thing about it, one of the things that helped us trace it from its very beginning is on the blade here, there's a number, a serial number. And the makers still had the records. So we were able to trace the sword from its very inception to when Robert Gouldshaw received it in a package in South Carolina. He wrote back to his family and said, Uncle George's crate with the wonderful new sword showed up. So that helped us document that this was indeed the sword that he carried that night. And we don't have a scabbard for it because it was stolen from his body with the scabbard. The scabbard never returned anywhere, but the Union troops were able to locate the sword towards the end of the war. So it came back to the family without a scabbard, but they still had the chamois that had been stored in when it's not in a scabbard. So they put the chamois on the sword, and down through the ages, it wound up in somebody's attic. So the mice got to the chamois, unfortunately, but they didn't get to the sword.
And it's a relatively recent acquisition by the MHS, right? 2017. And since then, people have come in to look at it, they've requested it, they've wanted to hold it. And this includes descendants of the 54th Massachusetts.
Well, you'll notice that where Peter's holding it, it doesn't have the sword knot on it anymore because so many people wanted to see it that just removing it, this very, very fragile sword knot was in danger. So it has been removed and it is stored flat separately so that we don't destroy the item from people wanting to love it so much.
It is this striking thing about the kind of magnetism of an artifact where there's a kind of direct connection between my hand and the hand of the maker and the hand of young colonel commanding the regiment. Mm-hmm. And then through a whole series of generations of descendants who had this perhaps without understanding what it was that had come back to them at the end of the Civil War.
Mm-hmm. But it's when we first received it, we put it on display July 18th, the anniversary of Battle of Fort Wagner, and a color guard from Company A of the 54th Mass Regiment came to what do we call that, to present arms?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And so it was a very moving ceremony. And at the end of it, they made the descendant that was there as a representative of the family, they made him an honorary member of Company A. So this is
which is the honor guard unit of the Army Reserve here in Massachusetts.
Yes, the 54th Regiment was in the 1980.
It very recently was reactivated to have served these honorific purposes, but then encompass people who are reenactors to interpret the history of the regiment.
But the entire 54th Regiment was reactivated in the Massachusetts National Guard. So it is an active serving regiment once again.
And we should note for our listeners or viewers, rather, this medium, who may not know, but Colonel Shaw was killed in that battle in Fort Wagner.
Yes.
So we believe he only had the sword for a couple of days before he was killed leading his regiment. Yes.
Twice, yes.
Well, so some of the ancestors may not have known the significance of the sword, but certainly the people who have come in to look at it and to hold it know its significance. What does it mean to them, Anne?
Well, I have a wonderful memory of Benny White, who was the founder and commander of Company A of the 54th Regiment. He and one of his colleagues in the company came to do a presentation to one of our high school classes. And I had on the table for them to see and to ask about all of our artifacts related to the 54th Regiment. And the sword was there. And Benny asked me if he could hold the sword. And I said, of course. So he put on the famous blue gloves. And I have this absolutely wonderful photo of him holding this sword. And he's not, you'd expect him a smile from ear to ear. No, this is a holy relic to him, because he's connected to people who fought in that regiment. So just the pride and the honor, it's just this wonderful photo of him. And it was taken a year before he died. So he's no longer with us, but I have this wonderful photo for memory. So
It's certainly a solemn moment.
And that's the tension of the story, because the story of Robert Gould Shaw and the attack on Fort Wagner, it's all true. It's an extraordinary story, but it should not stand in the way of our understanding the history of this regiment. This was 1,000 men recruited by Massachusetts, most not from Massachusetts, but regiment. Other Black regiments had been raised in the Union Army, but the regiment raised here in Massachusetts that received this sort of level of recognition in 1863. And it's important to remember that, again, the attack on Fort Wagner in July of 1863 was essentially the beginning of this regiment's service in the field, which had lasted through the remainder of the Civil War. And here at the Historical Society, we have an extraordinary archive of materials about the regiment, mainly thanks to one of the young white officers in the regiment, Louis Emilio, who documented the history of the regiment, published a history of it, informally known as a brave Black regiment, but accumulated the sort of stories and photographs and information about both the service and the lives of people who had served in the regiment after the war. And that continued through the remainder of the 19th century on into the 20th century, because these were very young men for the most part at the time of the Civil War. So many of them had long lives. Those who survived had long lives after the war.
Are there any other artifacts from the men of the 54th that you would like to mention briefly and encourage people to come see?
Well, there are the photographs, which are the most affecting things. We have all of those online, so people can see them and zoom in close up. But they're in person. It's like holding the sword. You're holding the likenesses of these young men who probably, with their $50 bounty, the first time they ever had that kind of money, were able to go and get their photos taken in their brand new uniforms. So, it's a direct connection to them. Some of them, I don't know that any of the young men that we have were from a company that fought at Fort Wagner, but
Oh, no, most of them were.
most of them were.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's just a wonderful connection to make. The other things that we have are bits of Minier bullets and what's the word I want? Shrapnel and
Yes, that's right. The shells and expanding bullets used during the Civil War.
And that give you an idea of the barrage of fire that came at these men, because the weight of these projectiles and the size of them is just it's horrific to think of making a charge at night against this firepower. It really it surprises people to see how face to face. I mean, they had their swords, they had their pistols. This was face to face warfare. This was not clean dropping bombs. You don't see your enemy. This was face to face, and the artifacts that we have bring that to you very, very vividly. So we often display those.
We're about to display material about the 54th Regiment, because the monument here in Boston has been refurbished, but the rededication of it has been delayed till next spring. So we put up a sampling of these extraordinary materials, including Robert Gould Shaw's sword, that'll be on display soon in our building through next spring. So people who can will have the opportunity to hear about this in the podcast and then come see a sampling of those things we're talking about.
Right, thank you. Shall we move to the 20th century? This is our third clip. This is from the final episode of season 1, and it relates to the career of Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. If people have heard of Henry Cabot Lodge, you're probably thinking of the grandfather who clashed with Woodrow Wilson over the League of Nations and the United States' participation in the League of Nations. This is not that lodge. This is the grandson of Henry Cabot Lodge, of World War I fame. He's best known as our ambassador to Vietnam, probably, during JFK's administration, LBJ's administration, and onward. But before he was America's diplomat to the United Nations and later on to South Vietnam, he was the senator from Massachusetts. And he was running for re-election, and it was a tight campaign in 1952, and he's running against Congressman John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And this is a little strange of a document. So this is a document, but this is a draft of a speech that was never delivered and was written for one of the most infamous individuals in American political history, Senator Joseph McCarthy. And I think this clip gives you a sense of what that was about. So clip 3. To learn more about Lodge's re-election campaign in 1952, we turned to Peter Drummey.
One of the most popular people within the Republican Party in 1952 certainly was Joseph McCarthy, senator from Wisconsin. And he had become, through his anti-communist crusade, a kind of nationally important figure. And the traditional way of seeing this is that Lodge refused to have the support of McCarthy as a matter of essentially a principle. But in this very large collection of papers that Lodge donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society, there's a draft speech for Joseph McCarthy to give if and when he comes to campaign for Lodge. It's hard not to think that the devil was whispering in Lodge's ear and say, do this, get his support, we're behind, this is something that may allow us to close this gap. But McCarthy did not come, and the speech was never delivered. It's a kind of what if, in the sense of it didn't happen, and if it did happen, would that have been alone enough? I think it's sort of interesting. One is the supposition is McCarthy will just come and say whatever's put in front of him. I mean, I think that's how little respect they actually have for him. But it starts out with a bracketed beginning of speech devoted to McCarthy's customary attack upon communism in general. Like, well, let's get that out of the way.
Yes, he has his boilerplate start to all of this. We have boxes and boxes and boxes of Henry Cabot Lodge Jr.'s papers. Why is this one, the one you were just holding up? Why do you think this one was so special, Peter?
As historians, we're supposed to stay away from what if questions, but we're not. This is sort of remarkable, this idea that Lodge, I think, thought and would have been seen as standing essentially against where McCarthy stood on a whole range of subjects. But in the peculiar circumstance of 1952 Massachusetts politics, Lodge was probably the liberal candidate. That sounds odd talking about John F. Kennedy, but the Democratic Party in Massachusetts was very conservative in its, especially in foreign policy. So Kennedy, one of the things Kennedy campaigned on that year is that Lodge was too supportive of President Truman. all things, an internationalist. So you have a sort of complicated story. You also have the peculiar circumstance of Joseph McCarthy, who's a Republican senator, nevertheless is very close to the Kennedy family, goes out on dates with one of John F. Kennedy's sisters, employs, soon after this election, employs Robert Kennedy, who is essentially his very young campaign manager in the 1952 campaign. So there's a lot of different things going on. So would McCarthy ever have come and campaigned for Lodge? He denied it. He sort of almost bragged that he had toyed with Lodge, let him believe that he was going to come and support him, and then didn't. Would Lodge really have gone through with this? Would the presence of McCarthy in Massachusetts been enough to change a very substantial lead that Congressman Kennedy had in this campaign? Kennedy won by 70,000 votes. So it wasn't necessarily, even though Eisenhower, who Lodge had worked very diligently to support, won Massachusetts in the presidential election. Lodge, who had been, this was his fourth run for the Senate from Massachusetts, but he was beaten by a substantial margin. So who knows? But it is sort of tantalizing that the image is that Lodge kept McCarthy at arm's length, and that sort of was part of his undoing. Before our eyes are certainly the evidence that he was considering and working hard up to a point to get that support for his campaign. So in this enormous collection of papers, perhaps something that's more revealing about how things happen behind the scenes than many official documents or official photographs. The collection's wonderful, very, very large. It's also, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. Bore the burden of being the custodian of his grandfather's papers from his his grandfather's death in 1924 up through the 1960s. Now, the grandfather had been the president of the Massachusetts Historical Society, and his papers were here on deposit. So this is sort of a family archive in some respects for generations of this family as well. But to find a single document in such an enormous collection is, and decide what is the thing that's emblematic of an enormous collection is beyond doing, but I think there's an interesting personal story that goes along with it.
Well, speaking of the enormous collection, I know there are a number of artifacts that are also related. So Anne, we'll turn it to you. I think you have one of the more interesting ones on hand. What do you have there?
I brought it, but it's really heavy, so Peter's going to hold it up.
This way, my Vanna White impersonation here. And it really is. This is
this is solid cast bronze. This is the infamous hot dog from that podcast.
And you won't be able to see it, but it says Henry Cabot Lodge across the, you'll have to see this and a digital image of it to sort of get a real sense
actually,
of it.
It's going into our favorite thing.
Yes, this will be another thing soon to be on display at the Historical Society. It sounds like we're campaigning for our own purposes here rather than your podcast, but they all go together.
They do. That's such a fun piece, Anne, and it's really heavy. It's, I mean, a marble base, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So combine the two and you've got a perfect paperweight.
Yes.
So some of the other things that we have, aside from the Nixon Lodge mugs, which didn't come with the Lodge papers, but are connected, from that campaign, the 1960 presidential campaign, we have I think 17 keys to various cities, and they range from little tiny lapel keys to massive, gaudy gilt keys to cities. There is one key that doesn't come from, it's from Lodge, but it's not from the American campaign. It's actually from Seoul, Korea, South Korea. It's a 20th century ceremonial key that is absolutely magnificent. It's cast brass, silver plated, and it's got some beautiful enamel. And I didn't bring it down because we kind of ran out of things to bring down, but or room to bring them down. But that is a really neat key. And I somehow I have to get into the Lodge papers and start looking to find out why he received this particular key, and then why he received a marshal's baton that was made in Saigon, Vietnam, when he was ambassador there. This is a military marshal, not like Harvard's marshal of their graduation commencement parades, but it's a beautiful thing in a very fancy box with silk inserts and everything. Again, that's something that I have to figure out from the papers, see if we can find a presentation citation when we get around to recataloging those. So
you're always on a detective hunt.
And he was extraordinarily, he has an enormous collection of personal photographs. These are often photographs taken of him and all the different aspects of his life. He also had a distinguished career during the Second World War. So there's a sort of subset of his collection of personal papers, which are about his military career. He was a reserve officer before the Second World War. And then, as opposed to many people from public life who are given sort of honorific positions in the Army, he played an important role, as he was in both one of the first people from the United States Army to have active duty in North Africa. This is before the invasion by the American forces of North Africa. This is in the Western Desert in Egypt and Libya for a brief time there. But then a man of had a really important career as a liaison between the French military and the American military through the campaigns in Western Europe, and all extraordinarily well documented in papers and maps and many, many photographs. He could look General de Gaulle in the eye because he was a very tall person of great personal elegance.
Wonderful. Well, I think we should move on. We'll be going to the Q&A in just a couple of minutes. So I hope for all of you listening and watching at home that, if you have questions about the items that we've been talking about in these clips or the larger episodes or the podcast itself, please go ahead and type those into the Q&A or the chat. While you're thinking of those, I will give you just a quick preview of some of the episodes that are coming up in the future. So as Kid mentioned, we released 5 episodes all at once for you in October because we were really excited to show you what the podcast was going to be like, what you're going to hear when you tune in. And moving forward, we'll be doing a monthly release. So starting in January, if you subscribe, you can get that content on a priority access, or you can always listen on our website. So starting in January, our next episode, we'll look at the history of the Salem witch trials, largely through the story of one woman, Rebecca Nurse. We'll be looking at the court records and specifically the petition documents that her friends and family assembled on her behalf during her defense. So this is a really interesting story that looks at her individual experience, the community's role both in defending her and accusing her. It's a really interesting story. I hope that you'll join us for that. During the same month, we're going to release our first bonus content. We have a piece of furniture here at the MHS called the Witches Bureau, or the so-called Witches Bureau, as I'm often reminded to add. It's a really interesting piece of furniture with a bit of a mystery around it, and we thought that it needed its own standalone story. So we hope you tune in for that as well, and shed some new light on it. So I think you want to join. Moving on from there, we're looking at a truly unique artifact called the casket of hair. You heard that correctly, that casket of hair. I won't say anything more about that. You've got to come and listen. Our president, Catherine Allgore, will be joining us. It's a fascinating story on the one hand of one woman's effort to insert women into the historical narrative. And on the other hand, we consider questions about why there is so much hair in our collections and in historical archives in general. So that's a really fun one. And then from there, we've got lots planned. We have, we'll be looking at documents and objects. I'm really excited for some of the documents we'll be looking at, including the Phyllis Wheatley letters. We have the largest collections of those, I think, than any repository. And the lost and recovered letters of Margaret Fuller, a 19th century intellectual. So those are just a few of the many episodes we hope to bring to you. I hope that this will entice you to keep listening. And if you haven't, go listen on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, website, wherever you get your podcasts. I hope you can tune in. So should we get to the questions?
We can get to the questions. I would make a plug that if you have comments or anything about the podcast, you can write us at podcast@masshist.org. And I think we have to thank the person who helped us get this off the ground, which is Liz Covart, who runs Benjamin Franklin's World. She has been instrumental in helping us through this. So thank you, Liz, for all your advice. The first question here. What was your process for choosing objects for the podcast?
Well, I mean, this has been such a fun part of it. It's maybe one of the biggest challenges because there are just too many interesting items, but I think we've selected them in an effort to show a range of our collection. So we want to move through the centuries. I think many people don't know that we have a collection from the 20th century. We're not known for that as much. So we're trying to bring objects from there. We're trying to foreground manuscripts since we are a manuscript repository. Do you want to add anything?
I think we were looking for objects that we could tell a good story. That's what we're looking for. As historians, we understand that history is made up of stories, and stories have a lot of power. They can entice people to learn more. They can get people to become historians themselves. And so I think we were looking for good stories to tell, quirky stories sometimes. The hot dog, for example, we're walking down the collections aisle one day and there's this bronzed hot dog. It's like, what is that? We really need to tell the story of that. For a lot of people, it's absolutely stunning to find out what we have here in this remarkable collection. I did not know that we had Paul Revere's account of his ride, nor did I know that we had the Newburgh Address written by George Washington. There are just so many wonderful, magical items that you read about and you learn about. To see it, to touch it, is something else. And that's what we encourage our listeners to do.
I confess that I've been sitting here and looking at the painting that's on the wall behind the two of you, Brook Farm,
Yes.
and thinking, goodness, we have not just wonderful records, but there's another example of where we have views of it during the time it was a utopian community, and really extraordinary artifacts. And to go to Anne's interest in numismatics, we have Brook Farm money, script that they had a
one piece.
they had well, there are only two that are known of, so
Yes.
that's pretty good. But at Brook Farm, they had a sort of internal economy where they valued everybody's work, men and women, and so they had an accounting of it. And because they didn't have much actual money, they had a printing press and printed a newspaper there, so they printed their own money. So we have this wonderful artifact, Brook Farm, a 5-cent note.
This is really how we choose episodes, is chatting
Exactly.
with Peter and Anne. They say, oh, we've got to tell you about this one.
Season 3.
Yes.
All right. I think we have a question here for Anne about Elizabeth's portrait. Was the painting of Mumbet done by Sedgwick's wife?
No, it was by Theodore Sedgwick's daughter-in-law. She was married to his son. And in that time and place, women were expected to have all these genteel skills like painting. And so she's clearly not a polished professional painter, but she's a very, very enthusiastic amateur. And she wanted to create this portrait of this woman that the family loved. So that's how that came about.
And we have a question here about the author of the McCarthy speech, or the speech for McCarthy. Who wrote this? Was it Lodge himself, or was it one of his staff members?
It's one of his staff members, and I'm not sure that we can determine who he had a small close staff, but it's clearly marked up, very heavily edited, I believe, by Lodge himself to sort of shape this. And a lot of it is hard reading. It's there's too many references to pinkos and closet communists that are not there as suggestions for what McCarthy should say. I think they could trust him to say those sort of things, but to sort of show that align Lodge with essentially McCarthyism.
Right. I have another question here. Have you considered any objects that you passed because they were too controversial or hard to verify the story behind? Well, I think the Witches Bureau is one of those stories. This is an object that you would find when you walked into the MHS, walk down a hallway, and we always said this was the Witches Bureau.
Yeah, well, let's not give it away.
Okay.
Let's not give it away.
I'm sorry.
But no. It's a perfect example because we've always had sort of, maybe it's this version, maybe it's that version. And Anne, tell us that you had to go straight to the source, but we won't give away the punchline yet.
The other thing about this is that we have thousands of items, artifacts in the artifact collection, and most of them just have sort of name, rank, serial number descriptions. So we're doing a program, we're going through and trying to upgrade the descriptions of everything in the collection, and it's still name, rank, serial number, but we're trying to add a little bit more meat to this. But we never can really fully take the time to really, really delve deeply and follow all these little rabbit trails, which Mary Jacobo, our head cataloger, and I like to do. It's only when we have something like a podcast or an exhibit or a loan where we have to know more about this item than simple description, cataloging description. So the podcast gives us a chance to go into depth and take the time to really, really research these items thoroughly. And sometimes we get surprises.
As for controversial and hard stories, I think as an historian, we have to tell the truth about history. We're not going to shy away from difficult stories. And so we certainly hope to do that.
As Peter says, you've got these very unflattering descriptions in this letter. We can't block those out. That was then, and that was part of history of that time. Right. We have to look at our ugly spots. It can't just all be happy history that doesn't offend anybody.
Well, Anne, you've mentioned that we have thousands of these objects and artifacts that they do not really see the light of day. Same with our paintings, that we simply do not have the space to showcase all of them. No. I'm curious, are there pieces and objects that are on loan to other institutions that you think would be something people should see and a story we should tell? Peter, this question's for you as well.
Well, we have a very long-term loan to the Museum of Fine Arts of the Admiralty ore, the mace of the Admiralty, which is the colonial court system. That is on loan to the Museum of Fine Arts, and it's on display in their colonial American section. along with downstairs, I think it's still downstairs, is the Gamaliel Bradford urn made by Paul Revere. So these are Massachusetts treasures that we loan to the Museum of Fine Arts because more people go through the museum than come here. So we want to make them available to the widest possible audience because we hold them in trust for the community. So we, for something else, we have a lot of union sympathizers and promoters' portraits on loan to the Union Club of Boston. And these are these large 19th century paintings that we don't even have the walls for, but they do. And so we're very happy to have them on show there at the Union Club where they make a nice connection and more of the public can see them than when they're just stored upstairs in our painting storage. And then we try to rotate paintings in the galleries. So you'll see that in where you are in the Red Room, there are mostly landscapes and cityscapes and maps so that people can see some of our maps, which are never really on display. So we try to rotate things periodically. We're a one-man crew, and I get anybody who's around to help me, as staff can tell you. So it's not a constant change, but we try to change things.
And we're terribly spoiled here. Just today, because of a chart, a restrike of plates that were printed by the Royal Navy at the time of the American Revolution. In the room where you are, there's a chart of Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket that I sacrificed to this new display behind you.
From his office.
From my office, but in return received a wonderful ship's portrait from the 18th century that has a connection to a distinguished Massachusetts family, the Quincy's, and it's so that we are here working really surrounded by an extraordinary amount of material, both in the public rooms of the building and even where we work in our offices. We have remarkable things on display here.
Well, I'm conscious of time here, so we're going to turn this back over to Gavin. But before we do that, one more question from the audience members. I'll throw this to Katy. How does one subscribe to the podcast?
Yes, so if you can listen on our website, but if you want to subscribe, you can do this through the right app on your phone or tablet. So if you're an Apple user, there's a podcast app. You can search for the object of history. And if you click, I think it's follow or subscribe, then the episodes will download automatically when we release them. You don't have to go hunting them down. Other options are Stitcher or Spotify. And you can always reach out to us if you're having trouble doing that.
So again, podcast@masshist.org. Back to you, Gavin.
Thank you all very much. This was a fabulous viewing of some of our most remarkable objects. If anyone missed where to get this podcast, you can see it, the information here, it's written out. And I would just like to thank everyone for joining us this evening, and I hope people learned something new, and I hope people will check out the podcast and send some feedback and let us know what you think. So I hope everyone has a great evening, and thank you all for joining us.